Wait, I just want to. Maybe you've already addressed. Maybe you've already addressed the critical or the assumption here that on average a religious person is going to think less critically than a non-religious person, right? That's the underlying assumption, right?
Yeah, there's evidence for that, but I don't want to I was just going at it from a conceptual level, not from the epistemological level.
Okay, so you can talk with him bearing that assumption, and I'll stay out of the conversation. But I wanted to engage with that assumption. Otherwise,
I mean, I think we've hit the end, right? Like, yeah, you've conceded that not the end, actual concept, that you've conceded that you can be religious and highly critical. Then I guess that hits that point. So it's all you, Danny.
Well, I'm just wondering what would the kind of argument or the kinds of studies that he looked at suggest that.
I mean, we didn't go into depth into the studies, but the assertion is that religion requires or encourages, and I would say both, a method of thinking which is at odds with science. And I claim, ultimately, I'm like a modernist and a little bit of postmodernist, and I think science is really the only way to know things, maybe excluding, like, you need a little bit of intuition and so on.
Okay, so do you think that science affirms mathematical truths?
I would say that math. How do I even assert this?
Just say yes.
No. I would say that math exists outside the realm of science. So when I'm talking about knowledge,
do you think that moral values? Do you think moral values are explained by science?
So I want to answer the math one before we move on. So when you get into math, what you're doing is assuming axioms and working from there. So they don't exist in a realm where science can investigate. When we're talking about science, we're talking about justified true belief about the external world. So I would claim that math is fundamentally an internal world. You can create it however you so desire.
You don't think that some of the mathematical truths that you know are justified?
Hey, they're justified, but they are just based on axioms, which are fundamentally just assumptions.
The idea is that science, again, has a lot of assumptions, just like math, that are non-scientific, such as the reality of the external world, the assumption of the math.
Comparable.
What? No. Listen to what you were saying, though. You were saying that math is disanalogous to science in that it has axioms or base assumptions to make justifications further down the knowledge tree within that discipline. But the thing is that science, it does that in the same way, right? There are going to be things that you're going to assume, such as the reliability of your cognitive faculties and your sense perception, the reality of the external world, that these kinds of things, and even science also presupposes the axioms that mathematicians presuppose. So that's to say that they are analogous.
Sure. So I fundamentally disagree. In math, what you're doing is constructing an entire universe of assumptions. So everything in math is based at some level on an assumption. We call them axioms. In contrast, in science, your goal is to minimize the number of assumptions, as is true in math. But your goal is to minimize the number of assumptions you need to make and try and maximize the amount of input you're receiving from the external world, which you can argue is itself based on an assumption, right? But this gets into even deeper realms of epistemology, where you're getting into, like, how can we know the external world exists and so on. And if you want to examine those, I guess we can, but that's not really about religion then.
My claim is that in the same way that mathematicians make critical assumptions in order to know things,
this is a meaningless assertion.
Wait. Science does the same thing, if not worse, in the sense that it carries more assumptions about the world.
Okay, but this is a meaningless assertion. To say that everything is like these systems are analogous because they all make assumptions, to me, that's
you were saying they were disanalogous in virtue of math carrying these base axioms or assertions, and science not doing the same thing.
No. So I don't know if you're not getting this. For math, you intentionally make the assumptions so you can construct something to the end. In science, your goal,
You do the same thing in science.
Your goal in science is not to intentionally make the assumptions.
Wait, actual comments. Are you saying that there's a difference between observed, like axioms constructed via observation, axioms stipulated?
Yes, I am asserting that, and it's fundamentally I generally adopt like a coherentist approach to truth, and I assert that, like, when you observe things repeatedly, I don't know. The idea is that when you observe things that seem to cohere together, that you can construct beliefs based on those. That is fundamentally the process of science. And I think that if you don't accept that, you get into like a foundationalist approach to epistemology, which I think is just totally unbased. So, like,
Do you assume the reliability of your cognitive faculties when you do science?
Yes, at some
Okay.
level.
So do you assume certain mathematical postulates or axioms when you do science?
No, those are not mathematical
So
axioms, those are logical
when
axioms.
I add 5 milliliters of a medication to 5 milliliters of a different kind,
I don't think you listened to what I said. Those aren't mathematical axioms.
what did you
Okay,
say that I
just
missed?
stop for a moment. Those aren't mathematical assumptions. They are logical assumptions. I didn't say that no, you don't assume them. I said wrong category. Christ.
I don't think you understand what you're saying. Right? What you said, look, what is your claim? I take your claim to be, and then tell me when to stop so you can correct me. I take your claim to be that math and science are disanalogous because math uses base axioms to create sort of these knowledge trees, right? Whereas science has a different goal in mind, and I don't even know what you mean by that, right? Okay, so then tell me once again your claim because I thought I repeated it word for word.
Okay, so in math, the entire epistemology, the entire universe is constructed in some attempt to link it to your underlying epistem. So in math, you could construct a mathematical system with no basis in reality. People have done so. In science, that is not your goal, and no one attempts to do so. Or I mean, I guess some people do, but the like mainstream science, you attempt to link it to your underlying epistemology, the underlying way that you observe the world.
Look,
in math,
the
you do not
the
need
goal
to.
is irrelevant. Okay, we're talking about how we establish a truth claim to be justified within both disciplines, and that's independent from our goals. So we're not talking about our goal of science or goal of math or anything. We're talking about how is it that we come to whatever the case is in both of these subjects.
Yeah, and the different goals result in different methods.
No. You see, look, you're saying that you make assumptions in math, right? And then those assumptions are not carried over, or that science does not presuppose anything like any kind of axiom or presupposition about cognitive faculties or whatnot.
Okay. Why don't we clarify it like this? Science makes one assumption that math does not. That assumption is your epistemology. You plug in your epistemology and you work from there to get to science.
I don't know what you mean by that. Could you explain?
Okay, like if we're talking about your tree of beliefs, at some level it all comes down to some starting set of assumptions.
For what? For science or math?
For everything, for epistemology.
Well, we're talking about in the context of science or math, right? You want to say there's a disanalogy, and I'm just not seeing it.
Yeah, and I'm explaining the disanalogy. So what I'm saying is that in math, you need not make any epistemological assumptions. You only need to make logical assumptions, and then you set up the set of axioms.
What's the distinction between an epistemological assumption and a logical assumption?
Sure. So a logical assumption is necessary to form true-false statements. Mathematical assumptions are just assertions. They assert like x is y, whereas logical assertions are a way to evaluate the equations x is x.
No,
x is
I didn't ask to you to differentiate between a lot like a logical assumption and a mathematical one. You said there's a distinction between something called an epistemological assumption and a logical assumption. So could you again give me the difference?
Okay, so both math and science rely on logical assumptions. All epistemology does. The difference is that science also relies on your epistemology. Regardless of your epistemology, so long as you adhere to logic, you can still have the same mathematical conclusions.
You don't think that we use our epistemology
result in different science?
You don't think that our epistemology comes into play when we're doing math?
It shouldn't.
Wait, so do you know let's drop the big words. You don't think that our assumptions about how we can know things apply to math?
I mean,
observations, right?
If you're asking, so I'll answer this on two levels. If you're talking about how mathematicians actually exist, yeah, it's very epistemology based. But in the ideal world of mathematics, it is entirely deductive.
The ideal world is entirely again. That's irrelevant. You were saying that mathematicians don't carry epistemological assumptions; they carry logical assumptions. I don't see the difference.
And so does science. I don't.
Right.
Okay,
Other than that, logical assumptions are a kind of epistemological assumption, right?
Okay. Both math and science assume some epistemological assumptions, but science must assume
so I'm glad you changed
them.
your position.
No, I mean, you want to categorize them as epistemological. I think logic precedes epistemology. I don't care how you semantically define them.
Do you know, again, how do you define epistemological?
Like the ability to know.
Okay, so then when we say we know things, right, do we not assume certain logical truths?
I think even to assert that, you need to assume logic. So it
Wait,
proceeds.
you think to take certain logical truths to be the case that you need to use logic for that?
Yeah, like literally by definition, yes.
No, that's not true because
It's even you heard it what you just said.
No. I can assume a logical truth to be the case without a justifier that's to say another logical strain of thought or line of reasoning.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah.
think I got it.
Let me try to make it as clear as possible. I can take a certain logical truth to be the case. That's to say to assume it without invoking logic.
No, because to assert that X is
No,
true.
you're just incorrect here. Actually, this is just like philosophy
Okay.
101 at this point.
So let's define logic, right? Logic, it's like the Darth Vader spiel. Logic, what I'm talking about assumptions are the very base laws.
Let's
It's
just
like
talk about
law of
the three laws of logic, right? In order to say that I believe that the three laws of logic are true. Need logic, right? Which it would sound just really stupid unless you're like some kind of infinitist. To say that my logical assumptions are the reason why I hold logical assumptions. That's what you're saying.
No. So it's that in order, how can you even conceptualize the statement X is true without already knowing what it means to be true?
Look, I don't. How do you know what you know without knowing what knowledge is? It's essentially what you're saying.
Like at some level, yes.
Are you a kind of infinitist or something?
No, I don't know how you're. Okay. Like, how could you evaluate the assertion X if you don't have any methods for evaluation?
Look, the burden of proof is on you. You shouldn't be responding to my question with a question. Right?
Actual communist boy is
Wait,
correct here, Danny.
Tasteless, please. Look, the idea is that you're saying that you require the rules of logic to assert the rules of logic to be the case. Now, what's your argument for that?
I don't know if I. Okay, so it's that you can't assert anything without the rules of logic.
That's not what was said. Now you're changing the story.
I mean, I apologize if I was unclear. Like,
but now I think it's it might be. I'm perceiving a bit of dishonesty. You said word for word, right, that you need the rules of logic to be able to assert the rules of logic. That was what you said.
Oh, sure. So I would also claim that it's that you can't know what it means for the rules of logic to be true without already knowing how to evaluate something as true. So demonstrably, you can't know what the rules of logic are without knowing what logic is.
When we make our base assumptions, we don't need to have a justifier for that because they're just by definition unjustified.
Well, so at some level, I agree with you, but so you are appealing to a foundationalist approach to epistemology, and I think that you should go as coherentist as possible. Because I think the one underlying principle of epistemology is that you should make the minimum number of assumptions. And at heart, logic is an additional assumption.
We already agreed. Look, do you assume the law of identity?
So, how do I explain this? So I think you have to. What happens is when there's a process. You are born. You already assume the law of identity. Then what you should do as a good epistemological skeptic is question whether you can remove that assumption. Then you remove it, you realize you can't form coherent systems, and you add it back in. So that is the way that you test whether it's a necessary assumption.
Yeah, so then I'm asking you, do you assume the law of identity? You don't have to educate me on what these different theories are.
Well,
I need your view.
What I'm asserting is that it's not that you just assume it out of the blue. You assume it because of what you're born already thinking, and because if you remove it, you
But that's
can't
irrelevant.
function.
That's not going to be a justifier, right? So therefore,
no, it is.
assumed.
It's a justified assumption.
Do you think that by explaining how I came to a belief that is a kind of inference or a justifier to the belief?
Like demonstrably, yes. If it coheres with.
So if
your
I
method
bumped
of
into
knowledge.
a tree and believe that you're an idiot, you think that justifies the belief?
No, because it doesn't cohere with your other beliefs.
The idea is that, which is to say, so you've demonstrated my point, or you've affirmed my point that a causal, an explanation for why you hold a belief, that's to say, to explain the causal chain as to what leads to a belief, is not necessarily a justifier. Okay, so we're not going to talk about. Look, no, I didn't misunderstand. You're misunderstanding the whole dialectic. Okay.
Okay.
So let me explain. The idea is that when we assume the rules of logic, yes, there are causal routes as to how we come to these beliefs. Okay, but those are not going to act as justifiers. We're not invoking an inference
I'm not
or a
referring to the
logic.
causal. This is what I'm saying. You're not understanding. I'm not referring to the cause. I'm not saying that a causal link shows that something is true. I'm saying that a coherency link is what demonstrates that something is worth believing in. And so I'm asserting that when you remove that belief, you can't construct coherent beliefs. So then you add it back in. Like, there's a difference between causal and coherent.
Yeah, I don't think this is relevant to my question as to whether you assume the law of identity. Right? I don't really care how you come to the belief, to the assumption, if you did come to the assumption.
Okay, it's an assumption and a justified one.
Okay, wait, no, assumption by definition is an unjustified belief. So you just contradicted yourself there.
No, so the problem is it's only justified via circular logic. So it is unjustified in that sense. But
you accept circular logic as a justifier?
It has to at the okay, so you know the Munchausen trilemma. You either have to accept circular or infinite logic or foundational axioms.
I'm saying I don't see it that way. What's the argument for why that's a sort of a true dichotomy of options?
Trichotomy. So the Munchausen trilemma is just like, I don't even know how to explain why it's true. It's that imagine you need to justify a statement X, right? So you say, well, X is true because I don't know, W, therefore X, and W, therefore X, right? So then, well, how do you justify W? Well, Y, therefore W, and Y, therefore W. So if you keep doing this infinitely, and you believe that you can go back infinitely, then that's the infinite solution.
I'm not an infinitist, right? The thing is,
you don't accept that one, but the other options are foundational.
Ironically, you're carrying the assumption that beliefs demand justifiers for them in your view, in order to hold them to be epistemically coherent, right? That's something I reject.
Okay.
You're gonna have to provide an argument for why I should do that.
So are you asking why you should need to justify beliefs in general?
I'm asking why my assumptions, like the law of identity, okay, require justification when I'm making no claim that I know them.
Sure. So I believe that the foundational principle of epistemology must be that you assume as little as possible. Because if you accept any other principle of epistemology, you could believe anything.
Let's make sure we have the same concept of assumption. What do you take to be an assumption, or what is it when we say that someone's assumed X? What does that mean to you?
It is any belief that is ultimately not based in a belief which is known to be true. So
it's not justified?
It'd be any chain of logic that doesn't have at its end something that is true.
So that's to say an unjustified belief.
I mean, yes.
Okay, so do you assume the law of identity?
And what I'm asserting is it's unjustified in the context of your entire epistemology.
But about 5 minutes ago, you said you had justification for it. You've contradicted yourself again.
So understand this. There are two contexts. One, in the context of your entire epistemology, I believe that epistemology either has to be infinite and therefore unjustified, or circular and therefore unjustified. So
wait,
yes,
that's not a true dichotomy.
Or it has to be an assumption, right? An assumption by definition is an assumption. So I thought that was clear, but
but no, you said either. Okay, well, the thing is that if I just assume, let's say I'm a foundationalist, if I assume a certain belief, right? Why is it that I can't take that route and have to either go the infinitist route or whatever route that you propose? Okay, so then we don't have an argument.
So you don't have to, but if you don't do so, then I think you're rejecting the principle of epistemology.
What's the principle of epistemology?
But
the thing is that how do you? First of all, I think I have made as few assumptions as possible, and I don't think that you actually know what those are.
Okay, so how would you know whether, let's say you've got a system and it's got 5 assumptions. How would you know whether any of those assumptions is necessary? What's the method for testing an assumption for necessity?
Well, that's just going to be based on, how I come to those beliefs might be through intuition or some kind of pragmatic end.
Okay, well, what I asserted, the method that I just told you about, you go through the assumption, you say, do I need this assumption to form a coherent belief? And you take it out.
You understand when you say need, that just means do I have a pragmatic end?
I mean, yes, that's what I'm, so for epistemology.
You're affirming what I said.
Well, I'm saying, I think for epistemology, you need 2 things. You need to specify your goal and you need to specify your method. And so the goal is to believe as many true things and as few untrue things. And the method at heart has to be don't believe any assumptions if you want that goal. And if you don't want that goal, I can't tell you what to do. But like,
I mean, I'm fine with yeah. I don't want to assume all of my beliefs. I mean, yes. I mean, but I look.
Well, then what do you want? What's your goal?
Well, no, the goal of the conversation is to kind of address your claim that you use logic to presuppose logic. That's why we're having this conversation. I think we've lost sight of that.
Well,
I want to go back to that.
You don't use logic to presuppose logic. You can't know what logic is without logic.
Wait.
Like,
you're saying, look,
define something without logic. So
let's be clear that when I say logic, I'm referring to the 3 rules of logic, correct? That's what we stipulated about 10 minutes ago. Okay, when we say logic, we're talking about the rules of logic.
Yep.
Okay, so then you're saying you can't know the rules of logic, but the thing is that when we believe the rules of logic, that's not knowledge, those are assumptions. Assumed beliefs are not beliefs that we can claim to know. Okay, so I don't know what you're talking about.
Okay, so what I'm asserting is that you made a choice at some level to assume the laws of logic. Why did you make that assumption?
Wait,
well,
I want to go back
I walked
to what
you
said.
through.
I want to remind the room what you said exactly, that you can't know the rules of logic without invoking logic. The thing is that I think you're not understanding that knowledge is not part of the equation in terms of our assumed beliefs. So you made a mistake there. Now you can continue.
I mean, I don't think so. So
wait, you don't think you said that?
No, I don't think I made a mistake. So
no, did you not say what I quoted you as saying?
I maybe I misheard it, but I do you want to? Could you restate it?
Yeah, you said you can't know the rules of logic, or you said you can't know logic without invoking logic, right? That's what you said. And the fact that you said you can't know logic, I think really points out that that you have all this confused, right? Because we would never say we know the rules of logic. Okay.
Absolutely, you could. No. Let's imagine that you just knew somehow. You just by God's divine.
You already said that you assumed the law of identity being one of the rules of logic, which is to say you don't know it. So then you just said that I do know the rules of logic, right? Which is you contradicted yourself again.
Okay, let's say that you just know through some divine inspiration that there is something which justifies the law of identity, non-contradiction, the third, right?
What you just said was riddled with what I perceive to be incoherent garbage, right? So
Okay, well, tell me how.
Well, you said, let's suppose some divine intervention causes you to know something. The thing is that I would say that if something causes you to know something in that way, it can't be knowledge.
Okay. What I'm asserting is, for the purpose of an experiment, imagine that you know something that justifies the 3 laws of logic. And this is a justified
imagine
belief.
that I know that I have a justified true belief about what?
I mean, about the laws of logic. That you have something that justifies the laws of logic.
But that's just garbled to me, because I just take justification to be something that follows from the rules of logic.
So fundamentally, what I'm asserting is, it is possible that you could have something which justifies the rules of logic. Now, you can reject that. You can say, hey, you can't justify anything without the rules of logic. And if so,
what do you take justification
you agree with what I'm asserting. Oh my God.
No, I'm not. I'm not agreeing. No, you don't know what justification means. Justification is that do you know what justification is? Right? And I'll explain it for you, because look, when we say we're justified in something, we're saying that we have a valid reason. That's to say something flows logically from the rules of logic or some kind of assumption. Okay, so when you're saying, perhaps imagine a world in which you know something, that's to say you have a justified true belief that justifies logic, it's incoherent garble, because what you're saying is that imagine that the rules of logic justify the rules of logic, which is precisely what I'm saying to be either circular or fallacious. And
okay, the whole point of this thought experiment was to explain that in a world where you could justify logic, it would be a justified belief.
Do you understand that is
we don't live in that world. I agree with you. Holy shit.
There's no world like that. Do you understand?
Maybe. Okay. How do you know that world doesn't exist? How could
we take the meanings of the words that what you said, we're justified and believing that we're just in the rules of logic. That is incoherent. There's no world in which that can happen.
Okay, you're just asserting it again. How do you know that no such universe, whatever, exists with these properties?
How do I know that? Because it's how do I know that that world doesn't exist?
How do you know that logic is universal?
What are you talking about? It's just,
Or
we're not talking
meta-universal.
about knowledge. We're talking about our assumptions.
Okay.
Again, this points to you're very confused in this area. When
Okay.
we don't know the rules of logic, we assume the rules of logic. Take knowledge out of the equation.
Okay. Danny,
You yourself said.
I'm not.
You
okay,
yourself. Wait, I'm almost done. You yourself said that you assume the rules, the logic. That's to say, you assume the law of identity. You said that in a previous part of our conversation. So I don't know why you're talking about knowledge.
Okay, let's do a two-step. Do you know that the law of gravity applies in all possible universes?
That's not a rule of logic.
Just answer the question.
No, since I don't assume the law of gravity in every. I don't assume it to.
Correct.
To be the case
Why
of every
don't you
world.
assume it in every possible universe?
Because why? Because it's not contradictory to say that the law of gravity doesn't apply to something.
Okay, so how do you know that something has to be not contradictory? How do you know that in every universe the law of non-contradiction is true?
You're saying gobbledygook again. Let me explain
Oh
why.
my
You said,
God.
"How do you know?" Look, listen very carefully. You're asking me, "How do you know that there's not that basically? How do you identify? How do you know that to identify a contradiction?" Is essentially what you're asking me. Okay, and what that entails is that how can you utilize the rules of logic to demonstrate that the rules of logic are violated?
Yes. So
Right? No, but that's garbage.
No. Let's imagine that there's two universes. One is ours, and there's another universe where there's only one thing. In that universe, there is no law of contradiction.
The law. I don't make that. I just don't assume that that
Okay.
kind of world can exist.
Okay, but how would you know? This is very simple.
Why do I?
know?
This is like the third time of me explaining it.
Because you keep
Knowledge is
interrupting me.
irrelevant.
Literally every time I try to explain this.
Go ahead.
Oh, fuck.
Fucking
Go
God.
ahead. Go ahead.
So the question is, how do you know that the laws of logic apply? And you keep telling me, well, I can't know anything about the laws of logic. That's precisely what I'm asserting. Holy shit. Then you agree with my thesis.
I've said this 30 minutes ago that I assume the rules of logic. What are you not getting about that?
If you assume them, then you can't know that they apply. That's exactly what I'm
Obviously,
asserting.
because an assumption is just defined as not knowledge.
Great, then you can't know the universe doesn't exist where the laws don't apply. Then what you asserted
Well,
and how
first
you
of
got
all,
super mad at me doesn't, like, none of this makes sense. What the
Look,
fuck?
No, when we postulate possible worlds, we're just saying that when a possible world exists, that's just to say that that world bears no contradiction, right? That's assumed.
Okay, if you want to semantically define it like that, then I guess. But when I say possible universe, I'm just like not bringing any assumptions into it. And particularly for this one, I thought it was clear from context that you
Wait,
don't bring
no,
any
you already
assumptions
said.
of logic.
Well, you mean possible universe or possible
One
world?
moment.
Isn't it the same thing?
No, it's not, because the universe can exist in a world. The universe doesn't have to exist in a world, right? It could be that just abstract objects exist in that world and not the universe.
I thought it was the same thing.
No, universe is considered to be defined as all matter, time, space, all that stuff,
Right.
right?
Sorry, I missed that.
Okay.
Ooh, it's the world that we experience.
Danny, you believe that contradictions can't exist, right?
Yeah, I assume that that there's no world in which has a contradiction.
Okay.
That contradiction is true. That's to say.
So if you agree with me on that, right? If you agree that logic is itself assumption, then what I was trying to
I've
prove,
said that so many times. What? How did you miss that?
I didn't miss it. I'm agreeing with you that you asserted it's an assumption. So I don't know.
Okay, I'm glad
why
you
you're
agreed
getting
with
mad.
something that I said 50 minutes ago, and I'm exaggerating the time.
All right.
You don't need to get mad when someone agrees with you. So if you agree that it's an assumption, the question is why make that assumption? And repeatedly, I've asserted that you can only do so by testing whether you can eliminate that assumption. And I don't know if you have any method to tell me like why you make this assumption.
Okay, so you're saying that the reason why you yourself don't eliminate the law of non-contradiction as
Etc.
as being a belief that you should hold is because you can't test for it?
You can't remove it. Like you test it, it doesn't work, and you put it back in.
And so but that's not going to give you a justification for holding that belief. You understand?
No, it only gives you a justification in the context of your epistemology.
That's again. look, you just said it's not going to give you a justification for your theory of knowledge. Is essentially what you said.
So yeah, it doesn't justify.
That goes without saying.
Okay, so imagine the process works like this. When you're born, you already assume these laws. And in effect, you really can't not assume these laws. It's inbuilt to you. So what you do is you start by assuming them. You start foundationalist, but then you can use coherent principles to show that within the system that they've constructed, they are coherent. So
what do you take coherent to be?
That they don't contradict and that they are necessary.
So how do you know whether there's a contradiction?
Well, when you remove them, you can't evaluate contradiction.
No.
So
okay, go ahead. And I'll let you finish.
Just when you remove them, you can't know what a contradiction is. So therefore, you know you have to put them back in because you can't evaluate that system.
Are you trying to justify? I don't understand. Are you trying to justify and claim that you know the rules of logic? Is this what your endeavor is? Because
no.
Is that what do you? Then what is your point?
Okay, so you don't know that the rules of logic are true, but you do know that they cohere.
No, you don't. Wait. Okay, so you're saying you have justification for why the rules of logic are the case.
No,
are coherent, or that's what you're saying.
For why they're coherent.
Okay, so that's to say. Okay, let me make sure I understand that when you think about the law of non-contradiction, being one of the rules of logic, you know the law of non-contradiction is the case because there's no contradiction within that law, which in itself presupposes the law. Do you see the mistake you've made?
No. So what you're doing is testing whether you can remove those.
What do you mean by testing? I don't know what you mean by that word.
Imagine you've got a set of axioms, right? And you're seeing how many axioms. You want to assume as few axioms as possible. So you remove them, and then you test it, so to speak. You see whether it can hold up, it can internally cohere. And what I'm asserting is that
against what?
Against everything else. Like basically
coherence against the laws.
Sorry, go ahead.
The concept of coherence assumes the laws of logic to begin with.
So it does,
right?
And that's literally what I'm asserting. It's when you remove them, you can't apply the test method. So therefore, you know that it doesn't work.
The mechanism itself is built on that.
You're not removing them.
You're removing them and immediately undoing it.
You're removing them hypothetically. No. You're removing them hypothetically, right?
You're not removing.
Yeah, this is a thought experiment.
What you're doing?
Hey, Michael's trying. Hold on.
When you remove them,
there's like 10 people.
When you're removing them, even the idea of testing them presupposes their existence. This is what Danny's been trying to tell you.
Yeah, I agree with this.
You can just do whimsically. It's not even a hypothetical.
I mean, it is hypothetical.
It is hypothetical.
Okay, so it is hypothetical, but it's not. You are never proving that these are true.
How is it a hypothetical without the laws of logic?
No.
Honestly, when you say,
go get fucking.
Seriously, when you remove them, what does that mean?
Like you remove them. Okay,
How?
So imagine you've got.
What do you mean remove them?
You got your current epistemology, and then you've got like a little sandbox, okay? And you go into this little thought experiment sandbox, and you see, hey, what can I do in the sandbox to change my epistemology and still have it work? And so you remove this one immediately. You can't change anything. You can't test anything. And so, like metaphorically, you press like escape, and you're like undo, okay? Like that's Christ.
But you have to presuppose the laws of logic to identify what a sandbox is.
Okay, I agree with this. The whole idea is that you're already doing this in the context of an epistemology. This
is amazing.
I don't know how to
when you remove them.
What was the original point of this conversation?
What do you mean by the point? You said that you could use logic you can invoke logic to think that it's true, or to like kind of like form some kind of justification.
It is justified, but it's not you don't. It is justified in the context of your epistemology, right? But it's not justified in like an external context.
This is just garbage coming out of your mouth. I mean, like, it's just think about what you're saying. Justification is just to say that there's a kind of line of reasoning which follows either deductively, that's to say by the rules of logic, and you're saying that essentially by the rules of logic we can justify the rules of logic, which is circular. Now you admitted that 15 minutes ago. You admitted that 15 minutes ago, that it's circular. And then when I pointed out that that's a problematic, that I asked you the question, do you accept circular reasoning as not being fallacious? You completely forgot about that. You said that.
No, like circular reasoning is fallacious, but all epistemology is fallacious. Like at,
Do you know
at
what?
some
Oh
level.
my goodness! I can't. Well, do you know? Okay, now we have to go. If you think about what fallacious is, that's to say that there's an epistemic problem, right? It's a kind of epistemic problem. So when you're saying that all epistemology is fallacious, that's to say all epistemology it has epistemic issues, right?
Well,
Which is just
well-
like, what does that even mean?
Well, what it means is that there is no ultimate arbiter of truth, right?
Maybe you're using fallacious differently than I am.
How are you using?
I would identify fallacious with making unjustified assumptions.
Wait, so you think when I assume the reliability of my cognitive faculties that I'm being fallacious?
At some level,
ultimately.
yes.
Okay, well then.
That's a weird
any-
way to use fallacious.
Any axiom, right, is by definition unjustified, right? And but like you have to start with something.
Yeah, I think what might help you, actual communist boy, is maybe differentiating between unjustified. Well, you're taking unjustified and you're equating that to fallacious, but maybe you could do it this way. Think about the terms rational and irrational. I don't think that's a true dichotomy. Okay, we typically in the kind of circles that I talk to in philosophy, we actually establish three categories of beliefs. Rational, which is to say they're inferential, that that the rules of logic kind of and then the second one is non-rational, which are I take my assumptions to be. That's to say they're beliefs that I hold that don't utilize the rules of logic, but they don't violate them either. Okay. And then
Irrational.
Yes, irrational or non-rational. Maybe I think irrational might be. I don't know. It just depends on the person. And then the third kind of belief is irrational. That's to say, there's a belief that I hold that's incoherent, contradictory, or does not violate some kind of logical principle. Okay, and I think that you think there's a true dichotomy between rational and irrational, and I think you should discard that.
So what I would say is that the irrational beliefs, or the what do you call them? The irrational beliefs are fundamentally the things you have to assume.
Yeah.
But just because you have to assume them, like, quote unquote, have to assume them, doesn't make them valid. So they are still irrational.
No one's saying they're valid. No. Remember, I established non-rational and irrational. To say that something's not, that you believe something in an invalid way, to say it's irrational, not non-rational.
Okay, and what I'm asserting is that the category irrational is inside irrational. So they are a special subcategory of irrational beliefs that you just have to assume.
Suppose this, okay? If I said, if I was in third grade and my teacher taught me 3 times 3 was 9, okay? And then my parents asked me, what's 3 times 3? I said 9, and they said, well, why do you believe that? I can point to the cause, right? Well, I believe that because my teacher told me to. Now, that's not a justification, because it could be the case that my teacher taught me wrong, right? But if I just acknowledge that it's not a justifier, that I'm just explaining my belief, it doesn't make the belief irrational. But if I were to say that the rules of logic allow a kind of inference, that's to say that because my teacher told me 3 times 3 is 9, that therefore 3 times 3 equals 9, that's irrational, right? So there's a difference between pointing a cause. So like the cause of why, maybe it's that I'm just predisposed to believe in the rules of logic, as you were saying, you're born believing these rules of logic, right? But that's not going to be irrational. I'm not pointing to that as a justifier. I'm just pointing that as a kind of part of the causal chain that led to my belief, right? Which is why I think that the category of irrational or non-rational should be distinct from the category of irrational.
I mean, I'm really not sure if I followed. Could you try to summarize that in like a sentence?
Someone else can explain.
So I think
You didn't follow that, really?
So I think the main complaint is the notion of
You're denying basic things in epistemology. That's what you're doing, you idiot.
Oh my god.
roboting. I think the main complaint is the issue of irrational as carrying the idea of like being this contradictory thing, right? Instead of irrational being something that like it's not while it might not be justification, there's no contradiction. Does that sort of sum up?
I think we should move on. I don't think this guy's trying to like learn basic things.
I mean, I just don't.
No, don't worry about it. Don't explain yourself. It's okay. You tried. Let's just move on to something maybe a bit easier.
This isn't. So, like, the idea that you have to assume things fundamentally, and that you can.
No. Don't try. Don't.
All right, if you're gonna do that, you're gonna get muted. I'm sorry.
Oh, you're gonna mute me? Well, okay.
I mean, like, yeah, you're demonstrably derailing the discussion.
Demonstrably
I don't want to have this discussion anymore, man. You're supposed to have a productive
like, we can
debate
change
server.
topics. It's
we can change topics. Something's going to be easier for you.
Yeah, can we like change topics? Let's talk about
Joe,
you're being rude.
You're being a D-monster.
Don't you think, like, Danny explained that, he put his heart into it, you could tell he was being
sincere.
But this guy's like, could you do that in like a sentence? Guy.
No, I genuinely don't. I don't.
No one cares.
Adjectives for.
I'm also moderating. There was some guy posting like not too sure chat, but the important.
Do you want me to explain it? I'll explain it one more time if you want.
I mean, I agree with what you said, Joe. I just wouldn't put it that way.
But this is the last thing I'm going to say, and then I'm going to go get something to eat. I'll explain it one more time.
What are you getting, Danny?
I'm probably going to go get like some pizza. I don't have time to get like.
Too bad.
But anyways, okay. There's a lot of people think there's a true dichotomy as far as our beliefs between rational and irrational, and I think that there's a good case to be made for a third category of belief. Okay, and that's to say, that's the non-rational or irrational category, and I'm going to explain why I think that the irrational category does not belong with the irrational category of belief as you would have it, okay? Suppose, like I said, I'm a third grader, okay? My third grade teacher taught me 3 times 3 is 9, okay? Now, if my parents asked me what that was, and I said, well, 3 times 3 is 9, and then they asked me, why do I believe that, right? And I said, well, my teacher taught it to me. That's what explains my belief, okay? That I wouldn't be irrational, right? But at the same time, it's recognized in virtue of the fact that I did not say that because my teacher told me 3 times 3 is 9, that necessarily 3 times 3 is 9, right? Because that doesn't follow. There's no inference to be made, no valid inference to be made there. But I can still point out that that's what caused me to believe, and still leave out the idea that that's a valid reason to believe it. Okay. Now, if I was in third grade and I said, "Oh, well, 3 times 3 is 9," because my teacher said so, that's just the appeal to authority fallacy. Okay, I would be irrational for making that invalid inference. So we can point to our causes of our belief. We point to our causes of our beliefs, and as long as we say that they're, in some cases, as long as we say they're not, as long as we say that they're not actually licensed by the rules of logic, then I don't think you're being irrational, right? In the case of like a teacher teaching you, okay? But if you were to say that my teacher said it, therefore it's true, that's irrational. That's an appeal to authority, right? So it's just how you cash out your belief. So when you say, I believe in the law of non-contradiction because it just seems to be the case, I can't help but believe that, I was born with that belief or whatever, you're not being irrational, right? Because you're not saying that the law of non-contradiction, the law of identity, is justified in virtue of me being born, in virtue of my goals, or something like that, okay? I think I explained it better. I explained it better. If you have it recorded, I think I explained it better the previous time. I just tried to reword it, but it might have backfired.
I mean, Danny, it might be better to like remind them. Look, you're not saying that they're being rational either.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And then that's the case. And I mean, when we say someone's so I try to delineate, differentiate between irrational and non-rational. A rational belief is saying that based on this kind of line of reasoning, can I say that this is necessarily true, that this conclusion is necessarily true, right? So if and I think that that's what Fish on Seed was saying there, that's the third category.
Great. So there's 2 things here. The first is that believing your teacher is in fact a rational, except at least some level of induction in your thought process. But
I think that's true.
But leaving that aside, right? Like, let's say the thought experiment didn't have any acceptable inductive route, You just accepted it because you're born that way, for example. Well, then I agree with you that if you want to call an irrational belief as just something that you just believe, regardless of your intent or like the reasons for it or whatever, sure, we can call that the category. But simply explaining what that category is doesn't explain why it doesn't fall into the category of irrational. Fundamentally, it's a belief that you don't have a valid justification for, which is, you explicitly said this in like your explanation. So I think you actually agree with me that it falls in irrational. You just don't want to say it.
No, I don't. Look, irrational is just to say it's invalid. If I say, look, the reason why I believe that 3 times 3 is 9 is because my teacher told me, but I don't think that I don't think it's necessarily true because my teacher told me. Do you think I'm being irrational?
No, it's the teacher's job to teach you.
He actually thinks that's
stuff.
being rational.
If it was wrong, then like you.
Okay, so there's two things here. If you're merely asserting something about like reality, like X is true, which is the assertion, my teacher taught me that 3 + 3 is 9, then that isn't even an assertion about your own epistemology at some level. It's like,
hold on. So do you think that irrational is a valid concept? And if you do, what is irrational?
Like he's saying that it's something that you're just born with, or you
No,
have,
I'm asking you. No, I'm asking you.
I don't think it's valid.
Do you think irrational is a meaningful concept? And if so, what is irrational?
I mean, I think the way he's described it, it's just things that you don't have a good reason to believe, but anyway.
You don't think anything is just absent irrational? Everything is either rational or irrational?
Like, yeah, and then there's a subcategory of irrational that's just you're born with it, or etc.
Maybe it's Maybelline.
Like just to be clear, imagine that you had a genetically modified species and somehow you can make them believe false.
Wait a second.
That would be irrational belief.
You might be like focusing too much on that example. Just think about the categories. Set aside his example of his explanation of how you might arrive to something that's irrational. Just think about the 3 different categories of rational, irrational,
but
and
he hasn't
rational.
explained that there's a difference between.
That's fine. But do you think that someone could? You just disagree with the explanation he's offered so far.
No, I don't think you ever could make a case that irrational is different than irrational.
Wait, communist boy, you don't think there are things that are just not constrained by logic? Like, I don't know, let's say, like, preferences, right? You think a statement like, I like vanilla ice cream isn't irrational?
It's an assertion about your internal mental state.
Yeah,
so
which are based on what?
Your experiences of your internal mental state. Like, it's based on an empirical.
Right. Did you infer your likeness for some fucking flavor of ice cream?
Yes. Like, you literally infer your own beliefs. Okay, let me put it to you like
Was
this.
it rational or irrational?
No. I'm talking
What
about
does it mean to say that you're? What does it mean to say that you're irrational for liking vanilla ice cream?
No, it's not that you're irrational. You're making an assertion about reality. You're asserting, like, it is true that I like this, and I like this means my brain has a preference for this. It is an assertion about reality.
Michael, what were you saying? I stepped all over you. What were you about to say, Michael?
It's all good, dude. I'm not even going to try. I'm just going to get as frustrated as
Aren't you guys
Danny
talking
with this.
about the difference between practical reason and pure reason?
Actual communist boy. Let me ask you something. Do you think that that owl, like the ouch, has some sort of like inherent inferential process that results in ouch?
I mean, if you want to argue, like, you could argue that neurons are making an inferential process. Do that?
What?
Jesus, kill me now. Kill me now. Just kill me now.
But
Hold on,
so just to be clear, you could also assert it's a purely physical process.
Yeah, Michael, check your DMs.
Like this is a question. Like, is dropping a ball and then it lands on, is that a rational or irrational? Well, it's neither, right? It's just a physical process.
Is it weird of me to think that only agents can infer?
Stop me if this is where Danny already went, but like, is believing the laws of logic or abiding the laws of logic irrational?
That's where it started.
That's my
He's
assertion.
a mess there. He's a mess there.
It's not. There's no mess. Like, it's, you have to assume them, both because you've been born that way and because later, as you find out,
No.
you
You
can't
already
remove them.
no. You just said accepting things without rationality is irrational. So you have to irrationally assume them.
Yes. So you irrationally assume logic.
Abiding the laws of abiding the laws of logic is irrational.
Yes. or it's irrational in the context of your epistemology. It's rational within epistemology. Like, you have no reason to assume them beforehand, but once you've assumed them, they work within themselves. So from a coherentist approach, they are rational internally.
Well,
it's a rational strategy.
They'd cohere. Well, no, if you didn't assume that they'd cohere. If coherence means something else other than abiding the laws of logic, they meant not abiding the laws of logic, then they'd also cohere.
No.
Coherence means that they're not contradicting.
Right. What did I just say?
Okay,
you said that
coherence meant something else.
You said that
meant something else. If coherence meant not abiding the laws of logic, then they'd cohere.
Okay. If you defined coherent as not coherent, then
this is getting incoherent.
Christ.
Yeah, it's incoherent, but that's okay because I'm not abiding by the laws of logic. It's totally coherent.
I mean, like, sure, go ahead.
So what's the problem?
Well, in our previous conversation, he was saying that we need to employ circular reason at some point in our epistemology. But that's where I would contest. I'm saying we don't need to try to give an account, a justification for our assumptions, right? We can just assume them.
But why?
But why?
So what I was asserting there is that there's a principle of epistemology. Shouldn't assume things without evidence or without some reason to believe them.
I'm really done with it. I'm sorry I interrupted.
I mean, that's all right. And fundamentally, you're just saying that you can assume things without evidence.
What about that principle? Are you accepting that principle without any evidence?
No, so the principle is just arbitrary. There's no reason to accept it. It's
no, I know, but you would have to apply the principle to itself. So it's self-refuting.
No. So for epistemology, you need a goal and you need a method.
The principle.
So what I'm asserting is that this is the method.
Look, the principle is that everything that you want to hold must be held because of evidence. Now you're trying to hold this principle without any evidence.
Sure. So this is another one.
Completely self-refuting.
No, that's incorrect. So
how is that incorrect?
Well, I'd like to explain. So
try.
Thanks, bud. So the argument is that you false beliefs and maximize true beliefs. So if you assume that goal for epistemology, how can you maximize that? What method best achieves that? And I think that you can't prove this without assuming anything. You can only prove it, I think, experientially from having lived in the world. That the best way to do so.
Okay, look, you're avoiding the point, right? So I just pointed out to you. I just pointed out to you that your principle is self-refuting.
No.
And you just keep ignoring that.
Okay.
So how is it not self-refuting?
Okay, so the principle is that you shouldn't believe things without evidence. You have evidence for this belief. So
what's the evidence for that belief?
Sure. Again, you're starting with your lived experience. In your lived experience, the best way to reduce false beliefs is pretty demonstrably not to believe things you don't have evidence for.
Okay, but you don't have it. But again, you don't have any evidence.
Everything's fucking circular. Holy shit.
Look, you don't. The whole point is you have no evidence for that belief, for that principle.
And nobody has any evidence for things at that level. I've asserted that within your own.
I think we do.
Okay.
No, I think you're just confused. I think you're just really confused.
That's all right. Calling me confused isn't refutation. All I'm asserting is that when you live your life and you make assumptions without evidence, you're more likely to find that what you assumed to be true was false. And so
you're assuming that principle without any evidence, so it's thus more likely to be false than true.
What principle are you assuming without evidence?
It's just self-refuting, communist boy. How are you not seeing this? How are you not? It's really basic.
Why don't we put it like this then?
It's really basic self-refutation.
So let's put it like this: what is your principle that you hold that isn't self-refuting? What is the principle of your epistemology?
I assume the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, the law.
Those aren't principles. It's how do you decide?
Those are principles.
No.
What are you talking about?
No. You've got two epistemologies. How do you pick which one is better?
Maybe it might be because of my goals or
and how do you
my
pick
intuition.
That? Okay, how? How
are
do
you
you
asking me
from
what
your
causes
goals?
me to do that?
Oh, okay, I'm asking what method do you apply to epistemology A, B, C, and so on?
I may not apply a method. It may be just I might just be causally disposed to doing that. Do you understand the distinction between being causally disposed, providing a justification for how I believe or accept a particular theory?
So this is the second reason that this justification is right? The first one is
Wait, don't
experiential.
glaze
The
over what I
second-
just said. Don't glaze
I
over
am
what
responding to it. If you gave me 2 sentences, okay? So the second is that when you don't assume this principle, you could believe literally anything. This is the principle of explosion, essentially. It is when you don't assume.
What? That is not the principle of
Oh
explosion.
my goodness, this guy.
We're gonna work this one through, okay? So if you don't assume that you shouldn't make assumptions, then you could make any assumption. By definition, then you could believe anything.
Yeah, but that's not a principle. That's not the principle of explosion,
I
though.
know. I'm comparing. Oh my fucking god.
Okay, you can compare it. Look, you said that is the principle of explosion. You could say that is like the principle of explosion, and then maybe
Gotcha.
maybe
Thank
more
you.
people
So
would agree.
I'll change it. Right? It is like the principle of explosion. Thank you for semantically fixing it. Christ. Do you disagree?
Yeah, but it's not. It's nowhere near the principle.
Okay,
of it. I
you
don't
win.
even
You
think
win.
it's
You win.
like.
You
I
win.
don't even
Tell me
think
how it's
like.
different. Tell me how it's different.
Like I said, when you assume a contradiction, you can prove anything. That's the principle of explosion.
Yes, that is the principle of explosion. And how is that different from what I just said?
Because you're where are you assuming a contradiction?
Hey.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Comparison.
That's what I thought, Brainless.
Yeah, you just need to probably read a book or something. I don't know, man.
I don't know if you didn't understand this. The comparison was not in the contradiction bit, but the being able to believe anything bit.